On the morning of her 25th birthday, Maren Whitlock stood outside the county courthouse in a simple ivory dress, holding a bouquet she had made herself, while the man she had promised to marry 10 years earlier was nowhere to be seen. At exactly 10 o'clock, the courthouse clock chimed above the bright town square, each bell striking through her chest like a warning that she had mistaken a childhood promise for something real. She tried to smile at the elderly clerk waiting beside the glass doors, but her hands were shaking so badly that several white daisies slipped from the bouquet and scattered across the pavement. Maren had survived losing her mother, watching her father disappear into grief, working 2 jobs to finish college, and rebuilding a life that had once felt permanently broken, yet nothing had prepared her for the humiliation of waiting in a wedding dress for someone who might have forgotten her. Before we continue, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to our channel if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, because sometimes the promises we make when we are young become the quiet thread that leads us home. Maren looked across the sunlit square and remembered the day the promise had begun. She and Callum Pierce had been 15, sitting beneath an old maple tree behind their high school after both of them had been rejected by the people they had secretly liked. Callum had held up a grape soda like a champagne glass and announced that if neither of them had found the right person by 25, they would marry each other. Maren had laughed so hard that soda came through her nose, but she had raised her bottle anyway and agreed. They had carved the date into the underside of a wooden bench where no teacher would notice, June 14, 10 years later. At 15, it had felt like a joke designed to make 2 lonely teenagers feel less unwanted. At 16, it became their favorite story. At 17, it became something neither of them dared to examine too closely. Then graduation arrived, life pulled them in different directions, and their friendship became a collection of birthday messages, occasional phone calls, and memories that seemed warmer every year. Maren had always been the responsible one. After her mother died unexpectedly during Maren's first year of college, she returned home to help her father manage the small neighborhood bakery her mother had loved. She abandoned her plans to study architecture, telling everyone she would go back someday, but someday kept moving farther away. Her mornings began before sunrise, though the story of her life unfolded beneath daylight, kneading dough as golden sun filled the bakery windows, delivering pastries to offices during lunch, and sitting beside her father in the afternoon when grief made him forget orders, recipes, and sometimes whole conversations. Callum, meanwhile, became a traveling photojournalist. His work took him across the country, documenting wildfires, floods, community rebuilds, and ordinary people showing extraordinary courage. Every few months, a postcard arrived at the bakery. One showed a lighthouse under a pale sky. Another showed a field of sunflowers. On the back, Callum always wrote some variation of the same sentence, still single. Promise still stands. Maren saved every card in a flower tin beneath the register. She dated occasionally, but each relationship ended for a different reason that somehow felt like the same reason. One man said she was too devoted to her family. Another insisted she was emotionally somewhere else. A third proposed after only 8 months, and Maren realized she felt panic instead of joy. She turned him down kindly, then sat alone in the bakery the next afternoon, staring at the flower tin and wondering whether her heart had been waiting for someone she had never truly allowed herself to want. 3 months before her 25th birthday, Callum called her during the lunch rush. His voice sounded older than she remembered, tired but familiar, and after a few awkward jokes, he reminded her that June 14th was approaching. Maren laughed nervously, expecting him to dismiss the promise as teenage foolishness, but instead he said he would be there at 10 in the morning, outside the courthouse, and if she still wanted to keep it, he would bring the rings. She agreed before fear could stop her. For the next 90 days, Maren lived between hope and disbelief. Callum sent no romantic declarations. He made no grand promises. He simply checked in every Sunday afternoon, asking about her father, the bakery, and the architecture sketches she still kept hidden in a drawer. Those conversations became the brightest part of her week. Yet on the morning of June 14th, 10 o'clock arrived, then 10:15, then 10:30, and Callum did not appear. By 11, Maren's embarrassment had hardened into anger. Her father, Graham, stood beside her in a charcoal suit that hung loosely from his shoulders, trying to hide how worried he was. He told her that Callum might have been delayed, but Maren could hear pity beneath the reassurance. She handed her bouquet to the clerk, gathered the skirt of her dress, and walked away from the courthouse before anyone could see her cry. The town square was crowded with families visiting the farmer's market, children chasing pigeons, and couples drinking coffee beneath striped umbrellas. The cheerful daylight made her pain feel exposed. She crossed the street toward the bakery, determined to tear up every postcard and erase the foolish promise from her life. When she reached the corner, however, she saw smoke rising beyond the row of shops. People were running toward the western block, where an old apartment building stood above a hardware store. Maren froze as a fire engine turned into the street, sirens cutting through the morning. Instinct pushed her forward. Her mother had taught her that when someone was in trouble, dignity and disappointment could wait. Maren kicked off her white shoes and ran toward the commotion, her wedding dress gathering dust around her ankles. The fire had begun in the hardware store's electrical room, and although the flames were mostly contained, several residents were still being evacuated from the apartments above. Maren helped an elderly woman down the sidewalk, carried a frightened terrier away from broken glass, and used her bouquet ribbon to secure a bandage around a teenager's scraped arm. Then she heard someone shouting that a photographer had been injured while helping a child out through a rear stairwell. Her breath stopped. She pushed through the crowd and saw Callum sitting against the side of an ambulance, his shirt torn at the shoulder, soot darkening his face, and blood running from a cut near his eyebrow. One of his hands was wrapped around a small velvet ring box. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Maren felt relief strike first, then fury, then a love so sharp she almost hated him for making her feel it. Callum tried to stand, but a paramedic forced him back onto the stretcher. He had arrived in town before 9, he explained, and had been walking from the bus station when he saw smoke pouring from the apartment building. A little boy had been trapped on the second-floor landing, crying for his grandmother. Callum had followed a maintenance worker inside and helped bring the child down. His phone and camera were damaged, and by the time emergency crews treated him, the courthouse clock had already struck 11. Maren wanted to forgive him immediately, but something deeper stopped her. The missed ceremony was not the true wound. The true wound was 10 years of uncertainty, postcards instead of presents, jokes instead of honesty, and the fear that she had built her future around someone who could disappear whenever the world called him elsewhere. She asked why he had never simply told her how he felt. Callum looked down at the ring box and admitted that he had loved her since they were 17, but he had convinced himself that loving her meant not trapping her. He had watched her sacrifice school, travel, and relationships to care for everyone around her. He believed she deserved someone stable, someone who came home every evening, someone who had not spent most of his adult life moving from one crisis to another. Maren told him that deciding what she deserved without asking her was not sacrifice, it was fear. The words landed heavily between them. Callum did not defend himself. He apologized, not only for missing the courthouse but for hiding behind distance and pretending their promise required less courage than the truth. Maren's anger softened, though it did not disappear. She sat beside him on the ambulance step while sunlight reflected off the wet pavement. Around them, firefighters packed equipment, rescued residents embraced one another, and the little boy Callum had helped clung to his grandmother. In that ordinary, chaotic morning, Maren understood that Callum had not abandoned her. He had made the same choice he had always made when someone needed help. The problem was not that he cared too much about the world. The problem was that both of them had spent years believing love required one person to become smaller. Maren had made herself smaller for her father and the bakery. Callum had made himself unreachable because he feared his restless life would hurt her. They had been faithful to a promise but unfaithful to their own hopes. Graham arrived carrying Maren's discarded shoes and listened quietly as they spoke. Then, with tears in his eyes, he confessed that he had known about Maren's architecture applications hidden in the bakery office. He had also known she stayed because she worried he could not manage alone. He told her that grief had made him dependent, but he no longer wanted his daughter's love to become a prison. He had already accepted an offer from his longtime assistant to become a business partner, and he had secretly submitted Maren's old portfolio to a respected local design firm. They wanted to interview her the following week. The revelation broke something open in Maren. She had spent years believing that leaving meant betrayal, while her father had spent those same years fearing she would never leave because of him. Callum reached for her hand but stopped before touching it, giving her the choice he should have offered long ago. Maren placed her hand in his. She told him she did not want to marry him merely because they had promised at 15. She did not want a ceremony built on loneliness, nostalgia, or fear of turning 25 alone. She wanted to marry him only if they were willing to choose each other as adults, with honest expectations and room for both of their dreams. Callum said he would leave long-term travel assignments and focus on regional documentary work, but Maren shook her head. She did not want him to surrender the work that made him who he was. Instead, they began discussing a life neither had imagined because neither had been brave enough to ask for it. Maren could return to architecture and specialize in rebuilding community spaces after disasters. Callum could continue documenting recovery efforts. They could travel sometimes and return home sometimes. They could create a partnership based not on sacrifice, but on shared purpose. The courthouse clerk, who had followed the crowd after hearing about the fire, approached them with Maren's battered bouquet. She explained that the courthouse remained open until 4. The license was still valid. The day was not over. Callum looked at Maren, his face bruised and uncertain, and asked whether she still wanted to keep the promise. Maren smiled through tears and told him they were not keeping the promise they had made as children. They were making a new one. At 3 that afternoon, beneath the same maple tree behind their old high school, they were married in the presence of Graham, the courthouse clerk, the bakery staff, several rescue department residents, and the little boy Callum had carried to safety. Maren wore her dusty dress and no shoes. Callum wore a borrowed jacket over his torn shirt, with a bandage above his eyebrow. Their rings were simple silver bands he had carried across 3 states in the velvet box. Instead of hiding their vows behind humor, they promised to speak before fear could create distance, to protect each other's dreams, and to remember that love was not proven by giving up everything, but by building something neither person could build alone. Before the small gathering ended, Maren walked to the old bench and reached beneath it, finding the faded date they had carved 10 years earlier. She realized the promise had never been about avoiding loneliness at 25. It had been a message from 2 frightened teenagers to their future selves, reminding them that someone had once seen their worth before either of them understood it. Callum placed his hand over hers, and together they left the carving untouched. Some promises, Maren understood, are not chains holding us to the past. They are bridges waiting for us to become brave enough to cross. In the months that followed, Maren accepted the architecture position and helped redesign the damaged apartment building with safer exits, brighter community rooms, and a courtyard filled with maple trees. Callum photographed the rebuilding process, but for once, he appeared in several of the pictures too. Graham flourished with his new business partner and began teaching weekend baking classes. Maren and Callum did not create a perfect marriage. They argued about schedules, worried about money, and occasionally slipped back into old habits of silence. Yet each time distance began to grow, one of them returned to the promise they had made beneath the maple tree: speak honestly, choose courage, and never confuse love with disappearance. Before this story ends, leave a meaningful comment about a promise that shaped your life, or tell us whether true love is found by chance or built through patience, forgiveness, and courage. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. Years later, on every June 14th, Maren and Callum returned to the bench in the afternoon sunlight, sometimes carrying fresh bread from the bakery, sometimes bringing photographs from distant towns, and eventually arriving with 2 children who loved hearing how their parents had once promised to marry at 25. They always told the story honestly. Callum had been late. Maren had nearly walked away. Both of them had been afraid. But the most important promises are not kept because everything happens perfectly. They are kept because, after disappointment, confusion, and years of silence, 2 people finally choose to arrive for each other with their whole hearts.